Well, hello there. I know you're not used to trifles beginning like this, but we have a very important announcement that we wanted to share with you in advance of the next episode. You know that on each episode of Trifles, we pick some topic, some trifling topic out of the Sherlock Holmes stories to discuss. Well, we thought that in the next episode, we would address your questions specifically. If you have a question, make this an Ask Me Anything for Trifles. We would be delighted to try and answer it in the very next episode. It may not be enough to create a full episode out of any particular question, so we will jumble a number of them together and kind of do a lightning round Ask Me Anything here on Trifles. In order to make this possible, here's what we need you to do. Email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com or simply go to this episode's show notes on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There, you can drop it in a comment all the way down at the bottom of the page. However you choose to be in touch with us and to ask us your trifling question, we will look forward to addressing it in the very next episode. Thanks, and stay tuned. This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 230, Luck in the Canon. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And are you feeling lucky, punk? Are you?
I am feeling very lucky. I've got my dice in my hands and my rabbit foot on my feet.
My goodness. Well, you're supposed to rub one and blow on the other. And don't ask me which, because I'm not a gambler.
21 red.
Odds are I would fail in that regard. Well, this is episode 230. If you'd like to find the show notes, you can find them at ihose.co/trifles230. Please get over to our website, sign up for updates. Whether you can sign up for email updates where we will ping you every week with the latest Trifles episode, or you can certainly subscribe to us on the podcast player of your choice. That would be fantastic because we don't want you to miss any one of our 52 episodes that we are producing this year. And if you're of the mind, if you'd like to support that volume of content, please see our Patreon page, which is available off of that show notes site. We are simply patreon.com/trifles. And there you can support us for as little as $1 a month. Every amount helps. And if you contribute at the higher amount, we'll have some thank you gifts for you. So thank you in advance. Well, I promised I would make you feel lucky, Bert. And look, I already feel like one of the luckiest guys around having you as a podcast partner. Can I just say that right off the top?
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I feel like one of the luckiest guys around having you as a podcast partner.
I feel the same way, except you're very repetitious, but I only listen half the time, so it works out.
Perfect. Well, you can say that again.
Yeah. I only listen half the time.
There you go. As most of our listeners. All works out. Yeah. Perfect. Well, I recently had the honor to present a paper at a Sherlockian Society meeting. I was invited to be the featured speaker at the Sherlockians of Baltimore's 5th anniversary meeting. And I was made an official SOB as a result, which is nice. I've been called an SOB many times in my life, but I've never been given the official assignation before. So it's nice to have that now.
Very nice.
The presentation was on May 15th, which interestingly was the same day as the running of the Preakness, one of the 3 races in the Triple Crown. And I thought it would be appropriate that day to talk about the subject of luck. Now, we don't really equate Sherlock Holmes and luck. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is usually someone who is bound by logic and reason. And, you know, he is the type that, he relies on things that are tangible, things that are predictable versus things that are on a whim of sorts. So it seemed to me to be almost counterintuitive to be talking about Sherlock Holmes and luck in the same sentence.
No, not at all, because from the very first appearance of Sherlock Holmes, luck features. In fact, if you go into Study in Scarlet, the first appearance of the word luck in the canon, and the word luck appears about 50 times, I think, in the stories of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes is exasperated after he has an opportunity to speak with the police constable John Rance, who we have just found, or we suspect that we've just discovered, actually bumped into the murderer. So without getting into any of those details, and when Holmes is done with that interview, he turns to Watson and says something like, "Can you imagine having that stroke of luck and being, unable to take advantage of it or not seeing it?" And then later on in Sign of Four, there's that wonderful opening scene where Holmes draws a series of conclusions that turn out to be about Watson's very sad brother. And they're all, as soon as Holmes assures Watson that he had no inside knowledge about the particulars of Watson's sad brother, Watson says to him, "How in the name of all that's wonderful did you get these facts? They are absolutely correct in every particular." And Holmes says, "That is good luck. I could only say what was the balance of probability. I did not at all expect to be so accurate." And then, of course, we have the famous quote, "But it was not mere guesswork," says Watson. And Holmes says, "No, I never guess. It's a shocking habit, destructive to the logical faculty." So Holmes recognizes and embraces opportune luck when it arrives, which is a very good thing.
Indeed. And it's from the school, I think, of another eminent Victorian scientist, Louis Pasteur. Pasteur famously said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And when you look at Pasteur's accomplishments, his innovations and his inventions across a wide variety of complex problems, he seems to have been on the cutting edge of everything, from dairy work to silk making, to germs and microorganisms. These things that he found himself in the midst of, it's because he prepared himself for it, right? He educated himself. He did the background work. So when something like this came up, he was simply prepared to respond to the environment. And I think that's exactly what Sherlock Holmes did, training himself in observation and deduction, certainly studying up on the history of crime. Watson tells us in that very first story that, you remember the list that famous list that Watson put together of what Sherlock Holmes's limits were. He says, what was it? Number 9 on that list was sensational literature. His knowledge of sensational literature was immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. And Holmes proves him right later on in the story when he's looking at the blood drops in Brixton Road, and he says to Gregson, it reminds me of the circumstances attendant on the death of Van Jansen in Utrecht in the year 34. Do you remember the case, Gregson? And of course, Gregson does not. He says, read it up. You really should. There's nothing new under the sun. It's all been done before. So he basically gives away his secret, in terms of showing up here. Is that I basically read a lot and I study up, and these things are handy to me when the time is right.
Yeah. And it just shows you how special Holmes was in that area, because particularly in the police force at the time, not casting any aspersions on Lestrade or Gregson, but it would seem to me that it was unlikely that most people who'd risen to those ranks in Scotland Yard at that time would be people who were inclined to library-like research, study, notations, memorization, things like that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I tend to think it's just another thing that makes Sherlock Holmes very special.
Absolutely. And, just from a personal / professional perspective, this is kind of how I got where I did at Ford Motor Company. I studied up on social media and digital communications. I educated myself on this stuff so that when the time did come, I knew how to make sense of it and had recommendations and became an expert in the field. And I think a lot of my colleagues, the traditional colleagues around the company, were an awful lot like Scotland Yarders, where they were, corporate and stayed and, they went through the process to rise to that particular level of their professionalism, and they were very good at what they did. But they didn't understand how this outsider could come with these fanciful ideas and these facts seemingly pulled out of nowhere and make sense of them. And even though I schooled them on reading up, you really should, they still kind of stayed on their old tried and true method. It was uncanny. Mm. But it's interesting to me to note that, when Conan Doyle developed the character, he really had this kind of different approach in mind, and didn't feel like the detective novels or detective stories had, done the profession much justice in terms of what was possible. And why don't we go to Conan Doyle's own words from this famous film that was taken in the late 1920s.
I had, of course, a scientific training, and I used occasionally to read detective stories. It always annoyed me how in the old-fashioned detective story, the detective always seemed to get at his results either by some sort of lucky chance or a fluke, or else it was quite unexplained how he got there. He got there, but he never gave an explanation how. That didn't seem to me quite playing the game. It seemed to me that he's bound to give his reasons why he came to his conclusions. And I used, as a student, to have an old professor, his name was Bell, who was extraordinarily quick at deductive work. So naturally, I thought to myself, well, if a scientific man like Bell was to come into the detective business, he wouldn't do these things by chance. He'd get the thing by building it up scientifically. So, having once conceived that line of thought, you can well imagine that I had, as it were, a new idea of the detective, and one which it interested me to work out.
It's fascinating to hear it from Doyle's own mouth.
It is. And he, among other things, was such a voracious reader and student of fiction. He grew up with stories, obviously, and acknowledged several times the importance of the work and stories and creativity of Edgar Allan Poe. In fact, I think at one point He said if every author who owed Poe a debt of gratitude for instructions and examples that garnered from Poe's writing, Poe would have a monument bigger than the Pyramid of Cheops or something like that, he said. But, yeah, so here is, Conan Doyle was a great absorber of information, but he also thought about what he read. How does this work and how can I do it better? And that's why he was an innovator, not only in his writing, but in so many other things. I mean, it was, as an example, life rafts resulted in his campaigning for improved safety conditions for, people in the Navy and other military, I think, armor for soldiers. I can't remember. There's a list of 5 or 6 or 7 things. And of course, he was the first one to argue for a channel tunnel, or one of the early people to argue for a channel tunnel, so that if in time of war Britain was blockaded, food could get into the island. And, very creative. And then, of course, there are the science fiction stories, The Lost World and so on. Real imagination and thought.
No doubt. No doubt. Well, why don't we pause for a brief moment and then come back and talk about some of the instances where Holmes used coincidence or eliminated coincidence as part of solving a case. Stay with us. In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the professions series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing 3/4. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book, in which a number of authors take aim at the missing 3/4. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest profession series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars, and that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at bakerstreetirregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today. Oh, and we're lucky to have the BSI Press as a sponsor. Really appreciate that. Well, we are going to talk about coincidences, lucky chances, etc., in the canon. So there are a couple of instances where Holmes eliminates coincidences in his path to solving the crime. One is in the cardboard box when he looks at the ears that were included. And he looked at Miss Cushing, he said, I perceived that her ear corresponded exactly with the female ear I had just inspected in the box. The matter was entirely beyond coincidence. It was the same shortening of the pinna, the same broad curve of the upper lobe, the same convolution of the intercartilage. In all essentials, it was the same ear. So, very clearly he determined that it couldn't be a coincidence that the ear in the box matched the ear on the woman to whom he was speaking.
Yes, well, as you've said, fortune favors the prepared mind.
Yeah. It's funny because Holmes always had a monograph seemingly available to kind of whip out of his utility belt like Batman at any moment. Batman always seemed to be carrying just the right solution in his utility belt for whatever situation he found himself in. So, and of course, Holmes was the original Caped Crusader. Let's talk a little bit about, Black Peter. You, of course, had the coincidence of the initials on the tobacco pouch, which pointed Inspector Hopkins in the right direction, or in one direction, I should say. But Holmes said simply by having the good fortune to get the right clue from the beginning is what set him in the right direction. He didn't know about the notebook that Hopkins knew about. And he said, if he had, it might have led away my thoughts as it did yours. But all I heard pointed in one direction: the amazing strength, the skill in the use of the harpoon, the rum in the water, the sealskin tobacco pouch, the coarse tobacco, all pointed to a seaman, one who had been a whaler. So he said, you remember I asked whether whiskey and brandy were in the cabin? You said they were. How many landsmen would drink rum when they would drink these other spirits? Yes, I was certain it was a seaman.
Yep. Well, and also the Bruce Partington plans. You know, there's a wonderful part where and it's just a terrific story because, of course, one of the issues and the great central mysteries around the Bruce Partington plans is how exactly was the central murder that kicks off these events done. And there's a lovely bit of dialogue there. The end is dark to me also, but I have hold of one idea which may lead us far. The man met his death elsewhere, and his body was on the roof of a carriage.
On the roof!
Remarkable, is it not? But consider the facts. Is it a coincidence that it is found at the very point where the train pitches and sways as it comes round on the points? Is not that the place where an object upon the roof might be expected to fall off? The points would affect no object inside the train. Either the body fell from the roof or a very curious coincidence has occurred. But now consider the question of the blood. Of course, there was no bleeding on the line if the body had bled elsewhere. Each fact suggestive in itself. Together, they have a cumulative force.
So that's interesting. When Holmes is able to piece together, 2, maybe 3 points to make his case, he relies on this cumulative effect. It's not just the facts themselves that align. It's the other associated factors that he puts into place there, much like he did with Watson's brother's watch. He didn't guess. He really, imagine something based on all of the things that were pointing in a particular direction. So, which interestingly is kind of, the opposite of what he says about circumstantial evidence. I think in, what was that? Which case was that he mentioned circumstantial evidence? Boscombe Valley Mystery, I believe. He says it may be all pointing in one direction, and if you look at it from a different perspective, it points entirely in the other. But these are the facts that he's marshaling in these cases. Now, interestingly, there are cases where Holmes says something. He says something can't be a coincidence, and yet it is. In 2 cases, the missing 3/4. Remember, Godfrey Staunton goes missing. He is the 3/4. And it's on the eve of this important rugby match between Oxford and Cambridge. And Holmes says, you must admit that it's curious and suggestive that this incident should occur on the eve of this important match and should involve the only man whose presence seems to be essential to the success of the side. It may, of course, be a coincidence, but it's interesting. Amateur sport is free from betting, but a good deal of outside betting goes on among the public, and it is possible that it might be worth someone's while to get at a player as the ruffians of the turf get at a horse race. And yet it had nothing to do with anyone trying to sway the match or try to kidnap the star player. It was something completely different, as we later found out. Something very tragic and personal to that player, as a matter of fact.
And it's that observation by Holmes that lays out that alternative explanation that does 2 fascinating things. One is it mirrors what most readers might well be thinking at this point in the case. So it carries them along, but also it sets up the denouement for a real surprise.
It does. It's a masterful bit of storytelling. And I think it works because it shows Holmes's fallibility in these cases, his willingness to, I think it was Copper Beaches, where he and Watson were on the train out to the country, and he said, I've formed seven different explanations in my mind, to kind of map out, where things are going. Now, we never hear what those 7 explanations are, but in this case, in the missing 3/4, it's interesting to hear Holmes pursuing this line of reasoning, as we ourselves might do, as you say there, Bert.
Mm.
Now, there's another instance of Holmes pointing out a coincidence that absolutely was a coincidence. What is that one?
Oh, well, that is in the second stain, where Lord Bellinger and Trelawney Hope pay a visit to Baker Street to disclose that a document has gone missing from Hope's dispatch box. And, there's a part in that discussion where more information comes into Holmes about who some of these people who are potentially interested in the contents of the document might be, and says, there are only those 3 capable of playing so bold a game. There's Oberstein, La Rothiere, and Eduardo Lucas, and I will see each of them. And Watson looks at the paper and says, is that Eduardo Lucas of Godolphin Street? Yes. Well, you will not see him. Why not? He was murdered in his house last night. And Holmes, says, well, Watson, what do you make of this? And Watson says, well, it's an amazing coincidence.
Yeah. And Holmes says, a coincidence? Here's one of the 3 men we just named, and he meets a violent death during the very hours when we know that the drama was being enacted. The odds are enormous against it being a coincidence. No figures could express them. Okay. And yet, it was a coincidence. His wife came all the way from Paris, was stalking him, was outside his house. Now, she saw Mrs. Trelawney Hope, Lady Trelawney Hope, leave the house. That kind of set her off. But she was already there. She was already planning something nefarious, as she had a dagger with her, and she killed her husband. Has nothing to do with the paper. Has nothing whatsoever to do with that missing document. So Holmes himself trying to play this up as a coincidence, and in fact, or as it not being a coincidence, and in fact, it was.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
Very good.
Tremendous. Well, we could go on and on about lucky chances, good fortune, and coincidences, and all the rest in the canon. It's probably a multi-part episode we could mount here. But in the meantime, because this is, it is Trifles, we should probably keep it on the trifling side.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What do you make of this, Watson?
Well, it's an amazing coincidence.
Coincidence? Here is one of the 3 men we have named as possible actors in this drama. And it meets a violent end during the very hours we know that drama is enacted. The odds are enormously against it being a coincidence.